Back in the book of 2 Timothy. I said it the first 3 weeks of the series. I'll say it one more time. It's my favorite book in the New Testament, and I'm excited to get to share it with you. We're only going to be in the last 5 verses of chapter 1 today. And if you're a very detail-oriented person tracking along in the series, you'll notice quickly that we skipped over 2 verses. And we did, but we're going to come back to them. So don't be dismayed. By the end of this series, we'll have gone through every verse in the book of 2 Timothy in our Bible. So last 5 verses of chapter 1 today. It is difficult to overestimate the importance and the impact of a good friend. And it's also difficult to overestimate the impact it has on us when one of our good friends turns out not to be a very good friend. Giving us good friends is actually one of God's favorite ways to take care of us. And it's difficult to overstate or overestimate the impact, the importance of a good friend. Think about it. If you moved somewhere, took a new job, went to a place that you didn't know anybody, and you had been there for maybe 2 years or so, and I called and said, "Hey, how's it going?" Your answer likely would come down to whether or not you have found good friends. Because if you had found good friends, you would probably answer like, "It's going pretty well. I've gotten plugged in to a community. I've made connections. It is beginning to feel like home." And then the opposite would be true as well. If you hadn't made any friends and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" chances are you would say something like, it's going okay. It's been an adjustment. And I don't know how long I'm actually going to end up staying here. And it often comes down to whether or not we have friends. I think, and I could be off on this, but I think if everybody in the room reflected on all of their life, and I said, "Hey, can you name a time or can you name a person who you would say, yeah, they were a good friend?" I think most of us could dip back into the archives and find somebody would come to mind. You might even have to go all the way to elementary school and remember that one boy or that one girl that was especially kind to you, and you can say, "Yep, I had a good friend." I also think that if we all dipped into the archives, I'll bet you most of us could think of someone who we thought was a good friend and didn't turn out to be a very good one. It's a very vivid memory for some of us, for sure. I dipped back into my own archives for this one. When I was in 8th grade, believe it or not, I didn't have a ton of friends. It was really more about me than it was about any of the other kids in my class, but I felt like I was on the outs. I was not very well liked. And I was trying out for the basketball team. And by the way, I wanted that to change. I was interested in knowing how to have friends, be a better friend. I wasn't digging my heels in and trying to be difficult. I wanted to have more friends. I just was trying to figure myself out. And 8th grade basketball tryouts come around. A new kid transfers into our school. His name was Ted. And Ted in 8th grade was 6'2". Ted in 8th grade could touch the rim of a basketball hoop. So this guy's a big deal. You know what I mean? Like everybody's talking about Ted, who's trying out for the basketball team, who can already touch the rim. Man, this guy's a big deal. And I thought to myself, this is my break. This is the chance that I needed. I'm going to get to Ted before everybody else gets to Ted. I'm going to tell him how cool I am until everybody tells him how not cool I am, right? And so I'm like, if I can get in with Ted, then Ted will help me get in with everybody else. This is actually my strategy. And I did. I befriended Ted. Ted was nice to me. I think, if I remember correctly, we hung out outside of school one time. I think we played Sims. Anybody tracking with me there? Close friends. We go through tryouts. I make the team. He makes the team. We're on the team. Ted's my man. Ted's being nice to me a lot. When we're one-on-one, it feels like Ted likes me. Saturday afternoon, after one of our basketball games, we had one more game later that afternoon. We go out to lunch as a team. I sat down at one end of the table. I saved a seat for my man Ted. And Ted apparently caught wind of some reasons why other people on the team didn't like me. And he walked by me. He said, "I don't think so, Joel." And he went and sat next to Mitch. You guys know Mitch, right? And he deserted me. He abandoned me, this man that I thought was my friend. It was in 8th grade. It's funny, I reflect upon 8th grade and I'm like, I can kind of get over the fact that I didn't have a ton of friends and I was still trying to figure myself out and where I fit, and that's fine. I can share that with you, no problem. In a weird way, remembering Ted walk by me at that table, it kind of still stings. It doesn't make me feel great. It's difficult to overestimate the importance and the impact of a good friend, but it's also difficult to overestimate the impact it has on us when we think we know somebody. I had been friends with Ted for like 13 days at the time. And I thought we were boys. And he deserted me. And so if you ever meet someone named Ted, and he's like 7'8" by this point probably, he will betray you. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure he's a great guy and he doesn't remember me at all. I share that to just ask you the question, have you ever felt betrayed? Have you ever felt deserted by someone who you thought was a friend? Paul, the author of this letter, wrote to Timothy, his spiritual son in the faith. Paul was about 60 or so, and he is in jail. And he knows that the end of his life is near. He has a feeling. He even writes about it to Timothy. But he believes that Timothy still has a few decades in him. Timothy's about 40, pastoring a church in a city called Ephesus. And Paul writes in this letter, we have it as our book of 2 Timothy in our Bibles, and he describes to Timothy the importance and the impact of a good friend. And he describes to Timothy the feelings, the emotions that go through him when he remembers friends that he thought were friends and who turned out not to be. What he's doing is he's highlighting for Timothy the importance of spiritual friendship. And so Paul, sitting in prison, writes this letter to his spiritual son Timothy. This is what he says. He says, Timothy, everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, including Phygellus and Hermogenes. How discouraging must it have felt to Paul to write, it just feels, Timothy, like everybody in the whole province of Asia has deserted me. Everyone who we thought was with us, turns out they're not. Paul spent 30 years of his life loving and serving the people in the province of Asia. The province of Asia, you and I know it as the continent of Asia that includes Japan and China and Indonesia. That's not what Paul's talking about. He's talking about the province of Asia, which is now in modern-day Turkey. And a lot of the cities that Paul planted churches in, cities such as Colossae, where the book of Colossians was written to, or Ephesus, or there's even some other cities that you're probably familiar with. Paul started churches in a lot of them. He's going, man, it feels like everybody has deserted me, including Phygellus and Hermogenes. It's noteworthy that Paul would have written their two names because it feels like they're the ones that they thought, you know what, even if everybody else deserts us, Phygellus and Hermogenes will not. And Paul writes, even the guys that we were counting on the most. You remember Phygelus. You remember Hermogenes, Timothy. Even those guys have turned their backs on me. How discouraging Paul must have felt in that moment. They bailed on him. But even while reflecting upon this indescribable discouragement Paul must be feeling, he quickly shifts his perspective and chooses to be grateful. And what he does is he contrasts the unfaithfulness of Phygelus and Hermogenes with the faithfulness and the friendship of a man named Onesiphorus. If there's one name I want you to remember this morning, it is not Ted, and it is not Phygelus, and it is not Hermogenes. It is Onesiphorus. He's only mentioned 2 times in the Bible, but he has become a hero of mine the more I've looked into this story. This is what Paul writes to Timothy about our man Onesiphorus. May the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, when he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. May the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day. You know very well, Timothy, in how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. His name is Onesiphorus. His name means help bringer. And he lived up to his name. Here are some things that we can know about Onesiphorus. These are very likely. It doesn't say this explicitly, but there are things that we can probably know about him based on what it says. Likely, Onesiphorus was from Ephesus. Later in the letter, Paul's going to say, greet the household of Onesiphorus. Well, Timothy lives in Ephesus, so we can guess, we can predict that Onesiphorus is from Ephesus. Here's what you need to know about Ephesus. It's one of the most important cities in the whole province of Asia. 250,000 people live there. It's the cultural center. It's a port city. It's where Timothy served as a pastor, and that's where Onesiphorus is from. Onesiphorus was likely a wealthy and well-respected man. In both instances that Paul talks about Onesiphorus, he says, greet the household of Onesiphorus. May the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus. And so when Paul writes that, he's not just talking about one random guy. He's talking about a guy who has a household, which would imply that he's married and probably has children, and his children probably have children. It's not like, make sure Onesiphorus knows that I'm saying hi. He's saying, this guy who probably has an entire estate in Ephesus, make sure the household of Onesiphorus is greeted by me. And it's likely that he was a member of the church in Ephesus. Of all the churches that Paul started, of all of them, guess where he stayed the longest? Ephesus. Some of the places that he would start a church, he would be there for a couple weeks. Ephesus, Paul served as their leader, their pastor, for almost 3 years. It's likely, perhaps, that Paul was there when Onesiphorus put his faith in Christ. When he was converted, became a Christian, decided to follow Jesus. It's likely that Paul was there with him. Onesiphorus had been a faithful friend to Paul. And Paul doesn't have a lot of friends. He's already remarked that it feels like everyone in the province of Asia has deserted him, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. And later in the letter, we're going to read about another guy named Demas. The only thing that's written about Demas is that because he loved the world, he has turned his back on us and deserted us. And these three are some of many, many people that Paul could have named. But those are the guys Paul didn't even expect. Of everybody that he expected, those three were probably the last. And even they have turned their backs on Paul. And so Paul thought they were good friends, but they have not. But our man Onesiphorus, the help bringer, he is a good and faithful friend to Paul through it all, not ashamed of his chains, is one thing that he writes about him. Let's dig in a little further and highlight some of the impactful, friendly characteristics of our man Onesiphorus, because once again, it is difficult to overstate the importance and the impact of a good friend. the first thing that we read about Onesiphorus is that he often refreshed Paul. To Paul, Onesiphorus felt like a breath of fresh air. He was refreshing to be with. You and I probably both know a person that we would describe as, man, it's just like they're like a breath of fresh air. And we probably also know someone that we would have to describe as morning breath. Somebody that you don't want to have to interact with. You're looking down the hallway, and you see someone coming. Some people, you are inclined to want to talk with them. It's often not just mutual interest. It's what they bring to the conversation. And then we also know, we sometimes look down the hallway and we just want to kind of sidestep into a side room and not let that conversation happen. To Paul, Onesiphorus was like a breath of fresh air. What are some of the characteristics of what we would call a refreshing person? They're encouraging with their words. They're interested in you. They're less interested in talking about themselves. They're more interested in talking about you. They're not hypercritical, always having something negative to say. They sometimes give you presents. But even more importantly, they often give you their presence. And their presence is not interrupted by their phone. And they don't always make you feel like they're in a hurry to get to the next thing. They're with you. These are some of the marks of a refreshing person. They remember things about you. They remember your kids' names. They ask good questions. They don't always try to one-up you and talk over you. They actually listen. They don't put their interests first. They consider others first. To use some Three Creeks language, they walk in the way of love. They converse in an others-oriented way. The question then from that is, for all of us, are you a refreshing person? Do you feel like a breath of fresh air to the people that you're talking with? Consider the difference for a second between an others-oriented, refreshing person versus a kind of self-absorbed, life-draining person. Let's play a game of Would You Rather. So, would you rather go to the barn or pick your favorite local Cameron Mitchell restaurant? You get to go to the barn, all expenses paid for dinner. That's option number one. Option number two is you get to run out of gas 4 miles from the closest gas station, and nobody is between you and the gas station. No cars are going to be driving by. Which one are you going to pick? I'm taking the barn. I don't know about you. That was a pretty easy one. Let me add this in. You have to go to the barn with someone who is self-absorbed and who sucks the life out of you when you talk with them. But you run out of gas, and the person sitting next to you in the car is a life-giving person who has joy despite the circumstances, and you have to walk 4 miles with them to the gas station. Which one are you picking? Man, the power of a life-giving, breath of fresh air style person, it changes everything. It changes everything. Onesiphorus was the kind of friend you wanted to walk 4 miles with. He felt like a breath of fresh air. Look what he actually did. Look what Paul writes that he did. When he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. Why was Onesiphorus in Rome? Onesiphorus is from Ephesus. Do you know how far Ephesus is from Rome? If you add up the miles that he would have had to travel by road and over the Mediterranean Sea, he would have had to travel 1,100 miles. It would have taken Onesiphorus months to get to Rome. Sometimes I feel the urge to want to be a life-giving person. I find out about a need that somebody has, and I think to myself, I'm going to be a good friend. I'm going to go serve them in their time of need. And then I find out it's all the way in Hilliard. I'm busy. Don't know if I could swing it. Onesiphorus did not let distance deter him. For Onesiphorus, being a good friend was at the top of the priority list. And he wasn't too busy to be a good friend. Sometimes, I confess, I am too busy to be a good friend. Rome was a large city at the time. You know how many people lived in Rome? I mean, Ephesus was a large city, 250,000 people. Rome, 1 million people, half the size of Columbus. Onesiphorus got there. The only reason that we know he went there was to refresh Paul. We don't know if he had other business to attend to. He may have. I don't think he did. He gets to Rome. They don't have records of where Paul's at. Paul's in a hole in the ground. And like searching for a needle in the haystack, Onesiphorus searches hard for Paul until he finds Paul. Keep in mind that Onesiphorus was not really able to go door to door and knock and say, has anybody seen Paul? Because the view towards Paul and the view towards Christians is not favorable at all. In fact, if he knocks on the wrong door and says, has anyone seen Paul? Chances are he's going to get thrown in the jail next to Paul. That's not what Onesiphorus came to do. But he searches hard for Paul until he finds him. And I, ever since I've read this book and begun to dig into this story, have always imagined what it was like when Onesiphorus got down. It's almost like a, what do you call it, a manhole. Like one of those covers on a prison cell that's in the ground. And I imagine Onesiphorus getting down and saying, hey, Paul, are you in there? And Paul, who knows how long it's been since he's seen a friend or heard a familiar voice, he says, is that Onesiphorus? And I don't know what Onesiphorus had. I don't know if he had food or water or letters. I don't know what he brought to refresh Paul. But I just imagine this overwhelming joy for both of them. Paul hasn't seen a friend in who knows how long, and Onesiphorus has been searching in Rome for who knows how long. And finally, the two friends are reunited. You can't tell me that there isn't power in a good, long, faithful friendship. All because Onesiphorus didn't give up. He was dead set on being a great friend. Look at the last thing Paul writes about him. He says, you know very well in how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. Onesiphorus was not a one-hit wonder. He did not just make one big donation to the church. He didn't come one time and help Paul out. Paul says, you know, Timothy, you know how many ways he helped me when we were in Ephesus. I mean, Paul had been their pastor for 3 years. And over the course of those 3 years, and apparently in the time since, Onesiphorus has proved himself over and over and over to be a helpful, faithful friend. And I'll bet you Onesiphorus probably didn't know it at the time. I bet you he was in his mind doing small stuff. But Paul goes, man, Timothy, he helped me in so many ways in Ephesus. So the question then becomes, do you have any friends like this? Do you have an Onesiphorus in your life? A friend who feels like a breath of fresh air? A friend who never feels too busy to care about you? A friend who has made it a priority to spend time with you? And a friend who has been there over the long haul? Can I ask you an even better question? Are you a friend like that? Does someone else answer the question, do you have a friend like this? Yes, while thinking of you. Are you the kind of person who feels like a breath of fresh air? Who never feels too busy to care? Who prioritizes spending time with your friends? Who's been there over the long haul for your friends? I mean, who doesn't want a friend like that? We all want a friend like that. It's difficult to overstate the importance and the impact of a good friend. But let me just suggest, and I can only suggest this, I've really thought about this and I've had to ask myself these questions. If you find yourself struggling to find a friend like that, perhaps it's because you're more interested in finding a friend like that than being a friend like that. Perhaps I mean, in our natural state, it's very easy to get this way. Perhaps we're more interested in being refreshed than we are in being refreshing. We talk a lot at Three Creeks about this idea of walking in the way of love, which means to live in an others-oriented way. And I talk to enough people, especially in my stage of life, who wish they had more friends. I wish I had more friends, but that doesn't start with going out and finding one. That starts with being one. That's actually what walking in the way of love would look like as it relates to friendship. Onesiphorus, he did not travel 1,100 miles to Rome, search hard for Paul to find him in Rome. He did not do that for himself. He has a household to manage in Ephesus. The entire journey was others-oriented in its entirety. It wasn't even his job. It wasn't his duty. He wasn't responsible. There were other Christians in Rome that could have refreshed Paul. But Onesiphorus said, you know what? I'm taking it upon myself to be a great friend, to be the help bringer, to honor my name, to honor God by refreshing my brother Paul. Friends like Onesiphorus, man, you and I both know they are rare these days. They are rare. And if you have one, if I ask you, hey, do you have an Onesiphorus, a good, faithful friend that you know would never desert you, someone that's been there for the long haul? If someone comes to mind, can I just tell you, that is a treasure. That is a treasure. One of God's favorite ways to take care of us is to give us good friends. And if you think, oh, you know, it's just a coincidence, we just met at work or we just met at church, let me just share with you, it is not a coincidence. That is providence. That is God's way of caring for us. He gives us friends. And I urge you, I implore you, today, this afternoon, call them, text them, do something that says, hey, just so you know, we talked about friendship at church today, and you came to my mind. It would be refreshing to the friend who refreshes you. Let me just tell you that. And if you want a friend like Onesiphorus, do not leave here today going, I got to go find one. Go and be one. You'll be surprised at how many Onesiphorous's might wander their way into your life because you've committed to live in an others-oriented way. I made a list here to close of things that we could do as friends that are easier than it would have been to find Paul in Rome. All right? So we can all do these things. Ask your friend to share their kid's sports schedule and show up to their kid's sports game. Send a DoorDash gift card for no reason at all. No birthday, no anniversary, no baby was born. DoorDash coming their way, no reason at all, just because you're a friend. Someone you know this fall is in a really, really busy season. Lots going on. I dare you to show up at their house with 25 empty, brown, large Costco bags and do their leaves for them. Find out someone's favorite coffee drink, write down the exact order on your phone, and a few times a year, just show up with it. Find out it's somebody's anniversary, somebody who has kids, and offer to babysit for free. Those of us that are looking for babysitters, man, half the reason I don't go on more dates with Morgan is because I can't afford the babysitters. Just say, hey, I got you. I want to support you. Marriage is a big deal. I got you. If you hear someone got very bad news, show up at their door with Jenny's ice cream. Not Grater's, Jenny's ice cream. It's better that way. And you might think to yourself, that's such a small thing. They probably don't want to see me. Ice cream doesn't seem like a big enough gift for what they're going through. Let me just tell you, it's not going to fix it, but it's really going to help. Because it's not about the ice cream. Somebody did that for me and Morgan on, I would say, probably our hardest day of our marriage, of our life. Jacob and Lauren, our neighbors, showed up with Jenny's, and it's difficult to overstate the importance and the impact of a good friend. If someone comes to mind, you just pray for them. And if you're tech savvy, send them an audio message of you praying for them. Be refreshing. Be refreshing. And all of those things are much easier than finding Paul in Rome. I find it exciting. I find it important that when Jesus in John chapter 15 is talking to the people that are going to follow him, Christians. And one of the things that he says is, I no longer call you servants, now I call you friends. And it was in that same conversation that Jesus said that there's no greater love that a person can show another than to lay one's life down for his friends. He was talking about himself and what he was about to do. That is what Jesus did for us. Jesus laid his life down so that we could be friends with God, friends with him. Friendship is a big deal. And God gives us good friends because he cares for us. And he gives us his friendship because he knows that we would go through times where it feels like we don't have any. But Jesus, the best friend, Onesiphorus is great. Jesus puts him to shame. He would never abandon. He will always forgive. He will always be there. And that friendship with him is available to all of us all the time. We're going to sing a closing chorus. And during this time, here's a few things that you might consider doing. Number one would be to reflect upon the friends that God has given you in your life. Maybe you're just going to write their name down just as a reminder to reach out to them later this afternoon, just to say that their friendship is a big deal. So you might consider the ways that God has blessed you with friendship. Number two, you might consider ways that you could be a great friend. Ways that you might reprioritize friendship, spiritual friendship in your life. And then if you want to pray about either of those or anything else going on in your life, I see the prayer team there in the back. They're available. They're prayed up. They're ready. They would consider it an honor to get to pray with you. And so if anything I said brings to mind things that you'd like prayer for, or if there's anything else going on in your life, we would love the chance to pray with you. We would consider it a real honor. And so would you guys stand? Let's sing this together. And if you'd like to pray, they're ready for you in the back. Thanks for watching. To find out more about our church, about when and where we meet, about joining a group, about serving on a team, about giving online, you can find all of it at threecreekschurch.com.